Welcome back to the No Nonsense Sustainability Podcast. I'm your host, Ildikó Almási Simsic, and today we're talking about sustainability disclosures. My guest is Robert Adamczyk, who's the head of the energy sector team at EBRD. He's got over 2 decades of experience in heavy industry and energy sector. He's one of the key architects of European ESG frameworks. He has developed guidelines for sustainability disclosures for Bucharest, Warsaw, and Prague Stock Exchanges, and is currently serving as a member of the Sustainability Reporting Technical Expert Group at EFRAG. Welcome to the show, Robert.
Welcome, and great to see you.
Yes. So you combine a very unique set of expertise with being able to do site-specific impact assessments and also the reporting. What was the moment where you kind of shifted from this project-specific work towards the more like reporting aspects of sustainability?
I think this is the sort of misconception. It's never been a shift. It's always part of the same work. And I've always looked at, of course, site-specific, but we always look at corporate issues wherever we have them, whether before the EBRD or at the EBRD. And the corporate side is just as important. And when we do capital markets as well, we just look at the reporting side. So is it a shift? No, it is using the data that you have from site-specific information. And when we finance site-specific, we need to make sure that these sites are actually fine, good, and we do know that do no significant harm is always at the core of everything we do. And we look at the corporate issues in terms of how they manage, what's the management systems. And the reporting is really reflecting those corporate management systems and procedures, and should do. And to be frank, when I started my career, got in the early 90s, was doing work on privatizations in Eastern Europe. And as part of the privatizations, we would assess each company, both at the site level and also at the corporate level, of their liabilities or the valuations. And I worked both for the state, particularly in Poland, but also for investors that were coming in. And looking at, of course, the site-specific issues, which in Eastern Europe were huge. And we were dealing with true huge legacy issues, contamination, pollution, large workforces that need to be restructured. Many companies we would go in would be looking at reducing the headcount by half or more because they were overstaffed. And that was the restructuring that was happening, which was very painful. Issues in the 90s, but also the pollution. The pollution side was huge. The health and safety quite often didn't exist. The health and safety, people were literally dying in these plants. And therefore, you had to look at the site-specific, looked at the impacts. There were no impact assessments done before these factories were quite often built. It was heavy industry because Eastern Europe was particularly heavy industry focused. And how to bring them up to European standards, stop eco-dumping. I mean, one of the first policies of the EBRD from the 90s, 91, was in fact to stop eco-dumping, stop factories closing in the West, polluting and moving into Eastern Europe to ensure that EBRD and other institutions didn't finance that. So I think the reporting side was always there. If I was doing a privatization, the prospectus needed to look at the liabilities. And something I repeat in many fora, I think, is that ESG risk is not new. Reporting liability is not new. You had IAS 37 in terms of accounting standards to look at provisions and contingencies. We have the EU recommendation from 2001 on how to address environmental contingent liabilities. And in every privatization, we would have to look, okay, in the valuation, what do we put on the books? And now, and it's easier when you're doing privatization because I can put a contingent liability or provision, which doesn't affect the actual cash flow. It's harder to do it once you are going ahead. So really the reporting side, and GRI was first that came out.
GRI is the Global Reporting Initiative.
Absolutely. And it's US based. And so you have the reporting standards have been for a long time. You've always had IFRS, and we're looking at ISSB, the global, looked at provisions and contingencies, as International Accounting Standard 37, and so forth, looking at those provisions. You needed to disclose. The problem was that everybody disclosed things differently. Yeah. Assessed things in a different way, and there wasn't a common standard. And therefore, a company with clever lawyers, and I worked on some of those projects before the EBRD, of hiring clever lawyers, or working with clever lawyers and providing advice, to say whether it's a liability or not. And you might have an issue in terms of pollution, but if it hasn't been discovered yet, do I need to disclose it? If there is no regulation that has come in, is it an important issue? You had the issue of a factory in the Czech Republic contaminating the Elbe all the way to Germany with cyanide, and it was only a €50,000 fine. So is it all the fish died in the Elbe? But it was cyanide, so it actually disappeared after within a year. There was no residual impact because it is a short impact but nasty impact. But the fines were small, and therefore, in a big corporation, if you have the impacts are small and therefore not material financially, they were often not reported. But reputationally, they could be quite big. Legacy issues can be big. And we had the cases, of course, ABB nearly going bankrupt of asbestos claims. We have a number of companies in different areas that have had the disclosures. And the heavy industry particularly needed to start to disclose information on their risks. We had mining companies for a long time looking at provisions for closure of mines. Now, again, not everybody provided that in the right way, or assessed it in the right way. Some mines are still not, they're no longer used, but they're not closed. And that is because you don't want to pay the restoration costs of that. So I think in the social, of course, issues, I mean, the Bhopal, no one actually was ever made liable for it properly in a full way, which is, of course, still astonishing in this world. But that side, I think, is where people have always thought about it. Always were looking at bringing some standards. We had the CSR, corporate sustainability, corporate social responsibility, CSR reports. But
even there, the scope was very different. And I guess that's what we're going to talk about today, how we're going towards providing better defined scope and more guidelines.
And I think this is where the change. So it came from good practice, providing information, quite often more on the philanthropy and more on the side of PR and marketing. And, every CSR report many CSR reports at some stage used to have sunshine, a nice baby and a wind turbine. Because
their scope was proactive, positive impact they created, and they did not talk about operational risk mitigation.
And I think this is where what we do, I'm in the risk department and I've always worked in due diligence, 30 years of working on due diligence assessments, starting in, as I say, in the early 90s in some of the most polluting, difficult industries at a time where information was difficult to obtain. So you could say, I have a good grounding of actually assessing, being one day in a steel plant and the next day in a Pepsi Cola bottling plant. You had the impacts, very big, or privatizing agricultural facilities where the issues were just as bad, if not worse, because of how farming waste was managed or not managed. So I think the areas that we've always looked at is that risk, liability. Venture capital firms, private equity always looks at that and always has. And that is in the valuations. And I've worked on valuations where we've reduced the cost of an asset by 20, 30% by saying you don't have the right documentation or there is a risk of pollution. And therefore it's material. But it didn't happen always. Worked a lot with, of course, that due diligence with legal firms. Because quite often it's also that client privilege. If I discover something on the due diligence, not to disclose. And the fact is that the US has always led on this risk. And I think still is in some ways. So although we have, and I think in the current world, there's a lot of changes, the US moving one way, Europe another. We've got Omnibus, which we'll discuss. We've got the Chinese standards, but liability remains the same. Pollution remains the same. It kills you in the same ways. Human rights violations are the same wherever you are, and we're all, I could say, equal. And therefore, the liability potentially is as high. People try to hide away from it or put it through the supply chain. That's where I think the challenges come in. But we have the liability's always been there and the risk. And irrespective whether I worked at the EBRD or before, and I think any venture capital firm will be looking at the same issues because it can affect them reputationally and can affect the balance sheet.
Yeah.
And the balance sheet ultimately is what they're looking at. And the balance sheet is quite often also, or the valuation is affected by reputational issues just as much. And this is where we come into the double materiality.
Exactly. So that's our buzzword of the episode, by the way. So if you had 60 seconds to explain it without me having to buzz you, what would you say? What is double materiality?
Double materiality is, first of all, the first things which I did in the past was the financial issues, the risk of pollution, liability, costs of investments. So I've got those sort of tangible issues that are there, but I have to look at my impact on having on the environment and how to cost to address it. But then environment can have an impact on me. And in addition, I've got the reputational issue. So the impact, of course, of climate change is one of those. The flooding, the risks of actually fires, and that is, and many companies can't get insurance anymore. So it's that side of looking what I do outside, what the environment does to me, and then the reputational side, which is, of course, quite often never be quantified, because that is the side which is quite often not tangible. As a reputation is sometimes hearsay, what's in the press. Sometimes whether it's accurate or not is another issue, but it can affect your evaluation. So I'm looking at the double materiality of what is significant to me, where do I have an impact, on where it can have an impact on myself. And the concept is what we do at IFIs always.
Scoping, right?
Yeah, but before we go to scoping, but as IFIs, the EBRD, IFC, others, we always look at double materiality. We don't call it that.
Yeah.
Because we look at not just the financial impacts, because as I say, there could be a fine of polluting a river could be very small. And therefore, from that financial materiality, it could be insignificant. If I have only a fine of 20,000 euros going through the magistrate's courts, it's immaterial. Now, the closure of the factory can have additional, and there will be, but there's all the reputational impacts, the cleanup, the actual side. I need to look at it. So it is significant more than that fine that can come over. The US, of course, has a different liability issues. And, in the UK, I get fined 20,000. In the US, I might get the punitive damages through a court, which could go into hundreds of millions. And that, I think, is also a difference where we're looking at. So the double materiality has always been there for IFIs because we look at the risks, the reputational risks, the impact on the environment and society. I mean, the social issues are just as important if and becoming more and more important, I think, because environment is easier sometimes to quantify and assess.
Yeah.
But the areas of social, on the other hand, is a lot more difficult and a bigger challenge. You have also the issues on biodiversity, because I can see the impact directly, I do.
Yeah.
But it's the indirect impacts. It's the associated impacts that come in. The same with climate. And of course, climate targets that we have, which are in themselves a liability. Because if a country has declared they will have certain reductions, I'll have to meet those. And that is in terms of emissions, equality and other areas, but also carbon emissions. And therefore, I'll need to have these plans and the transition plans. But
yes.
Going back to the double materiality, the double materiality is a risk management tool. And companies that have done that, and particularly under the CSRD, which has come in,
the Corporate Sustainability Reporting
Directive,
yes,
which has been subject to the omnibus. It's still there. It's still the same directive, but the number of companies that fall in scope has been reduced or is being reduced.
Yes, and that's quite a scandal. But
it is a lack of understanding by some, I think, decision makers. And I think politicians who think that it's a burden, and that there was a burden, and we did make a mistake in EFRAG and I think it's not just EFRAG, just as a whole professional society, of implementing the CSRD and straight away wanting limited assurance audits. We should have
what is the limited assurance audit?
So the limited assurance audit is that there's an independent verification of the requirements. Now, there's a reasonable assurance where you go into a detailed assessment.
Yes.
And a limited assurance is that where you go through an assessment. Now, there wasn't enough guidance. There maybe enough understanding of what it is, because a limited assurance needs to be, for the auditors, needs to have a reasonable opinion. And to get
what is the reasonable opinion?
That you actually do quite a lot of due diligence to opine whether it is correct or not. So what happened is, in many audits, the auditors went in, okay, but I want to review all your scope 3. Now, our intention was not to review your scope 3 at the limited assurance, and that it will be a cheaper audit of your procedures, and whether you did the double materiality, your scope, your assessment of the risks in the right way. And once it went into sort of doing more details, the costs went from tenfold in price, the changes. So, okay, that is, and then of course no one was prepared, and we should have delayed it by 2 years, basically.
But is that, so the quick word on what EFRAG is and who are the members of this expert group? So
EFRAG is the European Financial Reporting Advisory Group to the European Commission. So it's a body that is independent and advising the Commission. Set up by the number of states, EU funded approach. And it has a board, but it has a financial reporting and it has a sustainability reporting. For each one, there is a board. And the board is with representatives from different countries, but some also industry members, is the decision making. And that board is advised by the technical expert group.
And you're a member of that?
I'm a member of that. There's about 58 or something like that, and 60 people in that group, all together with some observers as well from some European institutions. That's the FISMA, EIB, Banking Authority, European Banking Authority. And you have also then members selected. Some have been designated by countries, but also members selected based on their experience and expertise, who are there. So I am there as an affiliated to the EBRD. So from the EBRD, here has allowed me to take that time out. But I am providing independent advice as an expert. So it is not, you should say, tilted on site. And we have discussions and presentations on the various issues, and the ESRS is very much aligned to the EBRD or IFC performance standards, or the current EBRD environment and social requirements under the new policy. Because they include environment, pollution, biodiversity.
Yeah.
They follow
same headings.
They follow the same headings, workforce, community issues, stakeholders. So we have, and then it's what we are reported, but in order to report, you need to understand what procedures and what data, and why is that data there? So this is where my involvement has been, particularly on the pollution and biodiversity side. Okay, what do we need to have? And also some of my old hat is involved in the bank, I suppose, on some of the social issues, but also labor issues as a representative in the bank of labor issues. Is or internals side, like the Works Council, is how do you address the grievances and information in the right reporting? But to do that, you need procedures. You need to follow international standards,
yes,
the ILO standards, the BAT requirements. So, and this is where they overlap with what we are doing in terms of projects. We're looking at ILO standards. We're looking at best practices. We're looking at IUCN requirements. We're looking at BAT requirements, water directive, and so forth. And these requirements is that we're trying to put on your reporting what procedures you need to manage those risks and assess those risks, and then report. So we don't maybe go as an IFI on the reporting side, is that side, but actually the core of the procedures is the same. Any project we invest, we want the institutions to have our clients to have the institutional capacity to implement our requirements, which are very similar, and ensure they have procedures. So the actual overlap inside is huge. The reporting, of course, is not what we're going to separate, but we have, it's very useful for investors, because if I am going to do a cap and then again, maybe turn back, the whole point of the reporting is simplification through standardization, as the former, still
But
correct.
Is it simplified? So most, the latest CSRD compliant reports, they're over 100 pages.
Well, some are 100, some are even 200, but some of the very good ones, particularly from some Scandinavia, 50. And they're audited and they're very good. So the question and the old GRI and the reports would be actually longer or CSR. So it's not a question of the volume. It can be 50 pages if done properly, even for a larger company. The problem is that there hasn't been experience, and therefore it's gone on a bit sort of wide. And this is why I think the audits, we should have allowed people to do, first of all, reports, and then came in on the reporting. The reporting is getting the key KPIs and providing key information to the stakeholders, and confirming you've got procedures to address those issues. And this is where the IFI, we're in the same. We want companies to have procedures, which we invest in.
Yes.
And we don't maybe require them as to do the reporting, or that we ask them to report to ourselves on the project level. But I think at the corporate level, it's very important to have that, because if I'm doing a capital markets transaction, then my access, due to also various restrictions, is quite limited. And I can only rely on publicly available documentation.
Yes, and these sustainability reports are publicly available.
They are. And if they're audited, then there is a certain reasonable assurance process in there. There is more confidence for me to rely. And if those reports follow a certain standardized approach and address issues in a similar way, of course, there will be better and worse and everything else. But that's life in everything. But at least I can make a judgment by reading it that it follows a certain set of standards and regulations.
But are these reports just data analysis? Or do they actually contribute to that continuous improvement of management systems? Because it's a little bit like a chicken and egg. Maybe you have good policies and then you can have a good report. Maybe you have the nice report, but you don't have the good management system.
So, it's a bit like you have ISO 14,000 old standards being put in place. And the fact you had a standard didn't mean that you had a management system in place.
Exactly.
Although it was certified, and whether you bought the certificate or not. So there is, of course, a risk of greenwashing, and there's a lot of EU legislation, and I think going on against greenwashing, or greenwishing even. So there is a risk that the reports are glossy reports that provide glossy information, and then there's no substance behind it. But I think the market will start to pan that out. And this is the whole point of, if you have a standardized approach, standardized reporting, and of course it's a shame how it's been cut down, the number of companies that are mandated to do that, because it's even hard to compare peers with peers. But the big companies will be there. There will be an audit system, and there's certain systems will be provided. And of course, if you misrepresent, these things come out eventually.
Yeah. So,
as we had with Volkswagen, or some other companies which had provided information which then proved not to be correct. And the hit that they had, particularly in the US with the liability issues, although it wasn't required in those countries to have that for misinformation was very, very high. So I think this is an area where if you have the reports, you will have and this is my take on it, and whether it's correct or not, is if I have the CEO of a company having to sign off a report and take actually accountability and responsibility for it, they will look at the data is there. First of all, the lawyers will look at it and then extend what are you assigning? Why are you signing this? Second of all, it will mean that there is a discussion at the board level of what am I signing? What is this data? What am I committing to?
Is it a commitment or is it a reporting on what's already been done?
It's a commitment because you are looking at some, and this, the whole, the ESRS is being slightly reduced, but the whole, original, you're looking at your longer term, commitments. And I think one of the things that already came out, once people had to start doing some of the requirements, a lot of companies suddenly said, oh, my net zero target is actually not as, and they backed out. And that was good. And that is good because you had a lot of companies commit to things without thinking about it or making PR statements. We'll commit to net zero. And then you go, well, actually your industry can't commit to that or your business plan doesn't reflect it. So you've committed to something which you haven't. But if I have to then make a statement in the annual report, which is subject to the same regulations as my financial report, then the liabilities are much higher. So the companies have, which is good because it means that we will know who really has in the target, who's thinking about it. The double materiality is usually done at the board level as well. What is significant for us? And this in the current world, you're looking at the time, of course, when we started the work was before the war in Ukraine. And that's terrible what was happening there. But we had it during the pandemic where supply chains suddenly became a bigger issue. Yeah. And so you need as a corporate, as a company and in your value chain to assess your suppliers and assess those supply chains. Is it really a material? Because a lot of companies found out that we have 3 suppliers, but actually they all come from the same factory. So if something happens in that factory, be it a fire, be it a flood, or there are real labor related issues, child labor, other things, and we need to stop that supplier, actually there's no other supplier. And that has allowed companies to assess their risks, assess their operational risks. And that's a key issue of the IROs is I'm trying to look at my operational risks on the sustainability front. On be it nature, be it on the supply chains, be it in the pollution or climate. It's a scope 3, of course, which comes in that I've just basically passed on the emissions elsewhere. And that I think is a good. And the companies that I spoke to that have done a proper double materiality, even when they didn't like the process of the reporting and the bureaucracy because of how the audit is required, one element they all said, and so far I said, the double materiality was a good exercise for us. It enabled us to look at what are the real risks, opportunities, reputational, which way we're going, and what it impacts our strategy or should it impact. And that I think is where it's good. And you shouldn't do it every year, the double material. You do it once and do it sort of repeated every so. It's a risk management tool that enables you do it once properly, and then you just fill in the sort of additional issues as things change. And that I think is essential in a good management system and a good corporate management and governance. So this is where I think that the overlap of what we were trying to achieve. And a good company will then see, okay, I need to put resources. I need to check my supply chains. Yeah. You know what? Do we build a car? But at least you're building, if I'm going to build a gas-fired power plant to supply myself, I will at least know that there will be costs and other issues, repercussions. Cooling water is a big issue. So maybe we should go away or maybe change the location. The supply chains, the entire, and this is where the European system, which was circularity, particularly in the current day, I want to know what materials, rare earth metals are suddenly becoming in short supply because of geopolitics. So do I recycle? Do I actually manage to utilize what I have? Where are those materials coming in to enable to complete my investments? And the question one is the Dutch, it was very interesting how lack of information can result in some very weird decisions. So the Dutch government wanted to nationalize a certain semiconductor operator because it was Dutch and with China and everything. And then seems to have forgotten that all the production was China. China stopped the supply of those semiconductors, which had the repercussion that some German car manufacturers were potentially under threat. And again, lack of information from a decision maker at a certain level, that thinking, well, we'll just take this and it'll be fine, showed how the supply chain, the value chain, because it's not only my supply, but actually who I supply to can have a very big impact on the economy of Europe. Never mind.
How much transparency is too much transparency? Because when we do our due diligence with our IFI hat, those are for internal purposes. Whatever we find, we do provide a summary on a website. But it seems like what we're talking about under double materiality and the value chain, these are very sensitive business information that can potentially make or break deals. So how much transparency in sustainability reporting is too much transparency?
I know. Okay, there's two things. First of all, there are some areas which are commercially sensitive, and that's why you have your legal team to go through and apply some of those clauses that this is actually sensitive or not. And that will be particularly in the defense industry and other areas that you will have, and that the application of that will take place. You have, of course, some of the basic data shouldn't be problematic. Your number of women on board in the management. That's information that should be there, and everybody should have that. What is your sick leave or what is the impact on your labor in terms of health and safety? Again, you send those statistics. They are out there if you want it. And 90%, if not 95% of the data that you have and you disclose is already reported into many regulatory issues. And
yes, but not in the same report. So that's the criticism for a lot of other initiatives, that the data is out there, but it's not centralized.
Yes. And this is what we're trying to do. So you'll have it centralized, and hopefully I can use that data. So the companies can't claim they don't have the data, because most of it is, particularly in Eastern Europe, we are still the legacy of you could say, communism, which has some good aspects about it in terms of the labor inspectorate. I would say in Poland is better than in the UK. Sanitary inspectorate has got quite a lot of teeth. The environmental inspectorate really goes in, can have a lot of teeth. So it is actually the old systems are there, and they're actually been functioning well. And in some ways you could say why Poland's a success. It's combined of both systems and developing, and actually the regulations are there, and yet it is moving at a fantastic pace. But it is, so the data's there. The data can be found through access to information anyway. But how centralizing it, the aim is to enable, we have to go back. The data was there for the financial markets and financial investors to be able to make a decision whether they invest or not. And having it in one pool and elsewhere. It also helps stakeholders, but to be frank, that was secondary information to stakeholders. The aim was that my analyst can have a look at a company, compare one company with another. Which one do I invest? Do I invest in the one that has a transition plan, the one that has outsourced everything production to China, or the one that has production and I know what the costs are in Europe, for instance? And that data would enable me to make an investment and look at the potential returns in the current volatile environment. So I don't think the data issue in terms of how much data there is. There are some issues which you have to prepare, and the transition plans, people didn't have them, your climate strategy, but you should do that anyway. You have the data in one place, absolutely utilizes it's what is useful for the financial markets. It is useful for investors to be able to compare one company with another. So hopefully will enable better capital flow and better investments to be made inside Europe, because I can make the judgment, and the whole point of the requirements to how to shift the investments and the private sector into those sustainable or better industries, away from those which are maybe not have a future or are worse. So it is a conscious decision for our pension funds, which I hope will be paying out in 30, 40, 50 years' time. Wow. Do not make those investments of, let's say, investing in a winery in an area which is going to be subject to drought. But maybe wine in England is a good idea. So it is that, but because it's a 20-30 years time, we're looking of those returns for that pension fund. So you need to look at those risks in the right way, and therefore they need to have the information to make those investments. The secondary, of course, then your suppliers will also want to know, well, do I supply this company or not? And do I, you could say, put my entire future with a company that has a future or doesn't have a future? Yeah,
I guess we often forget that suppliers are companies too, right?
Yes. And the suppliers also need to know, well, it's not just that I want any contract, but if I'm building my future based on working with a certain company. I need to know that that company has that. If it hasn't, for instance, is it still going to be producing diesel engines, and is not outsourcing or changing, is that going to be in 5 years' time still as big a market and as a supplier to them of widgets? Is that my livelihood potentially not threatened? Maybe I should look at some diversifying as well, where to sell my widgets. And that, again, is something I think people forget. Stakeholders, you could say the communities, but we want that side. But we also, as the example of the Netherlands, if our decision makers do not have some data and can collect that data, and the whole point of you have the European single access point, and so you'll have information flowing through with AI technology, we'll be able to zoom in that data. But if you haven't got data, we don't know whether we're on track of our transition plans. We don't know what about our suppliers and the supply sources in terms of where Europe, and this is a European CSRD, European system. I see it as an essential element of our sovereignty and survival as Europe, because we are dependent on external energy. So we need to decarbonize. We need to look at energy sources. We're dependent upon external suppliers of some raw materials. So I need to look at the circularity. I need to look at where materials, how can I maximize the use of it, and at least have information of where the sensitive industries, where I'm importing, not importing, and which ones are coming in. I need to look at water resources. Water is a big issue, huge issue. Droughts. We got droughts in Poland. So Poland is but it is a big issue. So water use, data centers need water. Where are you going to put the data centers? We will need to have that data on that side. Biodiversity, of course, a big issue is as well how we want to live. And the social side, the people issues, how we treat people, where the employment is. Do we pay our contractors on time? Subcontractors. Yes. Big issue is that many big companies don't pay their SMEs. And if their SMEs don't get paid for 6 months or a year, they go bust. So again, we need to understand which industries, which countries are not paying or not. The SMEs need that data to be able to, because then the governments can make an action and say, come on, pay up, or to do certain systems to help them. Because if you have delays in payment with high inflation, these companies will not survive. So again, it is essential for us as Europeans, and pollution, of course, if we are going to go into more defense industries, which we will for various reasons, then we don't want to have polluting industries coming in and saying, well, it's a state secret. Why am I dumping that mercury into the river? Yeah. No, you need to have those companies also applying systems and knowing where they are. And that reporting is going to be a very essential information, because you will have it through the regulators, but we'll go through the regulators. Now with the AI system, through the disclosure of information, you will be able to make, okay, we have a problem here in Europe. We need to look at certain areas.
Who's going to do that?
Well, the whole point is there's two ways. I mean, there's the one view is the market will help to shape and move, the invisible hand of the market. But the market has to have regulation. And therefore the regulators, and therefore the commissioner ultimately, but also member states, to be able to have information, which way will they go. And also important for CSOs, which are essential part of our life, and you could say, have access to data to enable them to focus their attentions of which way they need to focus to ensure that the living standards, are maintained in Europe, our air quality, our labor standards and everything is also maintained, and we don't sort of end up in a way which becomes just the sort of free market capitalism where no one cares about anybody, and you go on maternity leave and you get sacked, as it happens in some countries. I guess
some of these like labor related disclosures are interesting for me, because as with the ESG reporting, and they look at, is there a policy? Yes or no? They don't look at, is that policy appropriate for the scale and scope of the company operation? Does it really meet national standards? Because we assume it does, but sometimes it doesn't.
And this is where the ESRS are very useful. And of course, we will be publishing on the 4th of December. So there will be the new ESRS. They're cut down significantly because of the political will of a requirement. But I still think they're quite robust and will be useful. To ensure that there is reference to ILO standards, there is reference to human rights, and the auditors are there to review to ensure that those principles at least are materially met. And even if they can't do this all reasonable and then go into the full detail throughout the assessment, they at least check that these policies refer to is that there's internal audits, that there's internal assessment being done, and that these areas are addressed in the audited report. And if they're not, they will have to make a footnote and say, well, this we haven't got evidence or haven't got information, which will then allow NGOs or in due diligence say, okay, well, the auditors haven't signed off on this clause. So what's the problem? Or you haven't provided enough information. What's your problem? And that will enable to stack. And of course, auditors are not a full 100% foolproof system. That's obvious. But it is an area where the auditors do give a certain level of assurance and the risk management side. And that's what we're trying to do. And companies will start to have to think about the social issues, the dimensions, the labor issues, the ILO, the supply chains. And that is a good sign, because if you think about it, you can still make a decision. As I say, the CSRD does not allow you to create the Black Death Fund that will fund, war, whatever, child labor and everything. And you disclose it. That's my business plan. It's as long as it's legal, you can have that. And maybe, there will be some companies will say, I want to fund that. But at least you're transparent in terms of your business strategy, your objections and your investments. And that is the key. And that's what we're trying to do. So if I want to work with a certain company or want to be employed by that company or have them be working for me or be their subcontractor or working with them, I know what they stand for. And at least I can call them out on those issues. But it also means that the culture of the company will be sort of steering in that direction to actually apply these requirements.
Yeah. And I guess now employees and the public are more aware and sensitive to company mandates and sustainability initiatives. So going forward, what do you think will be the biggest changes brought to us by ESRS and CSRD?
Well, unfortunately, CSRD has been, the number of companies in scope has reduced significantly. So if I look at this, I was talking about the Polish Stock Exchange, we had, even an FRD, we had 3,000 companies originally in scope. Then we're looking at 200. Right now, there's 100 and odd that we're reporting. Only 51 companies will be on the stock exchange after report.
In all of Poland.
Yes, but those are listed on stock exchange. So there will be potentially up to 150, maybe 200, depending how this all final decision makes. But it shows the reduction of by 90%. Yeah. And is that right? No, it isn't, because many companies report anyway. It will be the benchmark. If the Europe reduces those requirements too much, then we will have the Chinese standard will be the benchmark. And it's going to be a very, paradox that Europe was leading. UK even at one stage was leading on sustainability. On the sustainability reporting and sustainable standards, China is making leaps and bounds forward. And if we are to use good industry practice, if it will become that the Chinese standards are the best, we will have to require. But we forget as well, not only that becomes the sort of golden standard, now whether it's applied in China or not, but it becomes the standard to be applied. But the Chinese companies we want to do business with will ask us for that information. And it's going to become a paradox that, in Europe we go, well, we've deregulated everything else. It's great. And the Chinese come, no. You want to do business with us? Give us information. And this is, I think, again, people don't understand that the world is moving. China is moving very in terms of renewable energy and changes. China has made, there are problems, significant problems, labor issues, other issues in China. And there are some areas which are atrocious as well. But China is leading in some areas. So the same will eventually happen in India as they develop. These countries are not backward. They are developing and moving fast in a very sort of fast evolving world with IT and systems. We are competing at global levels, and even with slightly deglobalization right now, these companies are international. We look at international resources. There is a need for capital to flow, and the capital does flow still between different areas. There is a large amount of money coming into different. And why do you invest? And you change the tax regime in the UK, you suddenly find a lot of people leaving. What's going to be the impact on that? There's going to be less tax revenue, so you have to increase the tax, and more people will leave, and it becomes a bit of a vicious circle if not well managed. And it is, unfortunately, in the world, unless you have one common standard, which we will not have in the foreseeable future, the world there will need to be these benchmarks. So I do hope that the European, that the EFRAG, the ESRS will be a good benchmark, will be utilized, therefore, by companies also on a voluntary basis. Now, of course, if you're voluntary, it means that whether you can rely as much, because it's not assured, it's a voluntary. And if you're voluntary, you can cherry pick, unless you audit them. And the companies go, well, actually, I'm not in scope, but I'll do it and I'll have myself audited. That will be a big area. As IFIs, we are requiring more and more information as well, and information on both the supply chains, on the biodiversity issues, on the labor issues. And I think that's where companies will have to also provide that information. Anyway, so they will use a benchmark. I say, hopefully you're probably not the Chinese, but anyway, but even so, it should become one. I mean, this is the global taxonomy that was being worked on, was aiming to do that. And the work is being slightly reduced and stopped, but it will come back. And we are looking at them maybe.
Do you think that's real? Do you think that there will be a global taxonomy and we will agree on the same standards that are applicable in all these different regions of the world?
Okay. Yes and no. I think we will have, there was a lot of work done on the global taxonomy. The taxonomy got a bit too complicated, and therefore it's sort of also, had its problems. But I think there will be, because there is a need to define, global. It won't happen it's stalled right now. It will happen in the next 3-4 years, I think. And then will be, and people like, Sean from Climate Bonds, will be, critical in developing a lot of things which he has. I think there will be certain benchmarks put forward and utilized. And the Climate Bonds initiatives, some of the ICMA work, they are setting up some standards to try to assess. The taxonomy, I think we need to have some definitions of what is green in terms of requirements, and therefore there will be maybe not a global standard, but there will be sort of references. We use the European, we sort of further update that. It got too complicated for people to actually implement it. Yeah. And that's the problem and I think this is a real problem sometimes, is once we put everything together, it becomes very complicated. And ultimately, we need a simplification. So I agree with the omnibus concept of simplification, for instance. We needed to simplify. Yes, we did. But it went on to the other side of deregulation, and people misunderstood the simplification from trying to cut everything and reduce. And particularly as people do it anyway. So I think, it's like, an economic, when you get to sort of a bit of a crash on the stock exchange. Yeah. And we've basically got a technical correction but it's gone too far. And they will come back. So the issue of this is where the CSRD is not dead. The CSDD has been amended, but it's not dead. It's been reduced in scope and the number of companies that apply. Okay, so we'll start to apply to the bigger companies. As we learn to develop it, it hasn't been that big shock that we wanted. We're a bit over ambitious. It will be implemented. We'll further refine it, and that it will percolate down to other companies.
Yeah.
And in the next 3 years, 4 years, people will realize what the impacts are. I think the political swings will go in a swing from the right to the left, and maybe go back to the middle somewhere, where there will be, I think, dialogue again between center right and center left, because right now the omnibus, the center right went with the far right to vote against environment and social legislation, which was the first time a certain consensus broken at the EU level, which is quite terrifying. But hopefully those parties will sort of have deep soul searching and come back to normality. And we will come back with the need, because it is needed. It's needed by the market. It's needed for Europe. It is needed for the global standard. Investors want to know what they invest in. They also, SFRD is being right now updated as well. We could argue for the better or for the worse, but it's being amended as well in line with that. That's an ongoing right now discussion. But there will be a need to invest, and a lot of investors and a lot of individual investors will want to know where the pension funds go. They will also want to know where they're investing. The pressures are there. And I think, in terms of renewable, side, I mean, they have to have the right regulations. We will move in that direction. So I think the pressures will come back. It's just a swing. It swung a bit on the other side, but it's still there.
Yeah.
And therefore, if the core is there and the big companies will have to report, it will come back and more companies will have to be reporting. It's the natural way of doing things. It's unfortunately that there was a knee-jerk reaction.
And I guess it will contribute to this like continuous improvement over time and continuous inclusion of more companies.
Absolutely. And as IFIs, we require certain data. We need to do good projects on sustainability, but also look at risk. I mean, the politics is always there, but ultimately we do not want to invest. We're doing whatever we invest. We have the principle, do no significant harm, and ensure that people are not worse off.
Yeah.
As a principle. And where we can, we try to make them better off, and we, through the policies, and do some net gains, or at least wherever we can. And that philosophy is embedded in our policies. That philosophy is embedded in what we do. And we don't want, if a project does net loss or has a negative impact, then maybe we're not the ones to fund it. There are sort of politically driven banks that can do this. But even so, the populations will not like it. And I think there is a risk aversion even among the sort of for most investors. And therefore, we're looking at that investment, and we look at how Europe is changing. We look at I'm from, as I say, Poland. We have the Warsaw has changed over the past 20 years. I'm sure as well.
Budapest, Hungary
is same. It's beautiful. It's nice. Cycling lanes, a lot of European money. Air quality's improved. Safety's improved. And that, I think, is, London as well. There's a lot of improvements. That's what, people want. We're not going to give it up, and people will vote if necessary. So this trend is a happening trend throughout. And I think it will continue. As long as we can, of course, affordability, but it's a move where we will want to direct the capital investments into those areas, because it makes our lives better, and we do then appreciate. And then cities boom and economies boom as a result.
Well, hopefully. Thank you for being here with me today, Robert, and discussing sustainability reporting and disclosures. We'll be back with some more next time.